What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That question lingered like the last whisper of a forgotten dream as Frank Adler stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at a faded Ohio sky. The windowpane rattled gently in the autumn wind. Brown leaves tumbled across the yard like the years he could no longer count on both hands. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and stubborn, just like his own body these days. His right knee ached from a storm coming in, and the coffee in his chipped white mug had gone cold without him noticing. It was his birthday. 72. No candles. No cake. Just a card from his daughter Emily, the kind with a stock photo of sunflowers and the message, "Hope you're doing well," scribbled above her signature. There was no phone call, no invitation, just that thin piece of paper reminding him how far away she drifted. Frank had stared at the card for hours. He ran his fingers over the ink like it might turn into a voice, or a bridge, or something that mattered. But it didn't. It never did. Later that night, after heating a can of soup he didn't taste and watching a TV show he didn't remember, Frank sat in his recliner, remote in hand, flipping through YouTube videos. Most were noise, people yelling at each other, people selling things, people dancing for reasons he couldn't understand. Then something caught his eye, a thumbnail of Elon Musk sitting in a warehouse surrounded by rocket parts, talking into a camera. The title read, "Why You Should Never Wait to Start Living." Frank hovered for a second, thumb over the remote. Then clicked. The screen shifted to Musk, mid-sentence, eyes burning with that odd blend of boyish wonder and ruthless ambition. "Some people wait until they're dying to live," Elon said, leaning forward. Why wait? That was it. Just those words. But they landed somewhere deep, past the rust and routine, where Frank had buried things long ago. He sat up. Rewound the clip. Watched it again. Why wait? He looked around his small living room. The old photographs on the walls. The dust on the bookshelf. The untouched boxes of blueprints in the corner, labeled Solar RV Project, 1991. That old dream. Back when he thought he'd build something that mattered. Back when his wife, Marion, still laughed with him in the garage, handing him wrenches and sneaking cold beers in the summer heat. That dream had died with her. Or so he thought. But now, that single phrase echoed. Why wait? Frank found himself walking out to the shed behind the house. He hadn't been in there in years. The lock was rusted. The door moaned as it opened. Inside, the air smelled of oil and old wood. Tools hung like forgotten soldiers on the pegboard. A single light bulb buzzed to life when he pulled the chain. On a dusty workbench sat the original sketch of his idea, an RV powered by solar panels, built for long road trips with zero emissions. People had laughed back then. Said it was crazy. Said it would never work. That was 30 years ago. Now electric cars ruled the road, and Musk was sending rockets to space. Frank whispered to himself, maybe I wasn't so crazy after all. He pulled a stool closer and sat. His knees popped in protest, but he ignored them. He picked up a pencil. Slowly. Cautiously. Then started to redraw the frame of his design. Lines shaky, eyes squinting, but the idea was still there. Like a spark in an old engine. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank didn't know why he started sketching again. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the way Musk had said it, like waiting was a form of dying. Either way, he stayed out in that shed for over an hour, just sketching, until his hands cramped and the cold settled into his bones. That night he didn't sleep much. His dreams were filled with sunlight bouncing off curved metal, highways stretching into forever, and Marion's laughter echoing in the wind. The next morning, he ordered a small solar panel kit online. Just a cheap one. Nothing fancy. Just enough to see if he still knew how to wire a circuit. The delivery driver looked at him funny when he handed over the box. Frank could hear the man's thoughts behind his smile. What's this old guy doing with solar panels? Frank said nothing. Just nodded and carried the box inside. That afternoon, he cleared off his workbench. Swept the floor. Sorted his tools. It felt good. Like shedding an old skin. He unpacked the panel kit, examined the parts, and realized quickly that technology had moved faster than he had. The connectors were different. The battery smaller. The instructions were written for someone who already understood the basics. He didn't care. He grabbed his magnifying glass, read every line twice, and started anyway. It took him 5 hours to get the first connection right. His fingers fumbled. His hands trembled. He had to take breaks, sit down, breathe slow. But when he finally hooked it all together, flipped the tiny switch, and saw the LED light blink to life, it was like seeing fire for the first time. He whispered, "Hot damn," and laughed. It wasn't much. But it was something. That night, he watched more Elon Musk videos. Interviews. Factory tours. Launch clips. Not because he wanted to be like Musk, but because something in those eyes, the refusal to slow down, the contempt for limits, made him feel less invisible. Less irrelevant. The next day, Frank walked to the local hardware store. The clerk, a young woman named Jess, blinked when she saw him. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mr. Adler. Everything okay?" He nodded. "Just need some wire. Thinking of building something." She smiled politely, the way people smile when they don't know what else to say. Frank paid in cash and walked home slowly, the bag swinging by his side. Every step a reminder of age, but also of motion. Of direction. He spent the week tinkering. Rewatching videos. Taking notes. Wiring things wrong, then right. His body ached in new places. His head swam with ideas. On Friday, he dug through the attic and found the old photos, him and Marion in the garage, grease on their faces, blueprints spread on the hood of their first RV. He placed one photo on the wall of the shed, right above his workbench. "You'd laugh at me now," he whispered. But he smiled. The days passed. The sketches grew clearer. The circuits more complex. He joined a Reddit forum on DIY solar builds, using the username OldWrench72. He asked questions. Got answers. Even got teased a little, but one comment stuck out: "That's a cool idea, old man. You should build it." He laughed out loud. First time in months. Maybe years. For the first time in a long time, Frank wasn't just existing. He was building. Planning. Dreaming. And maybe, just maybe, starting over. As the sun set on another quiet Ohio evening, Frank stood in his shed, looking at the mess of parts and papers around him. The light was golden, warm, like a whisper from another life. He didn't know where this would go. He didn't have a deadline or a business plan or a clue what people would think. But he had an idea. And a spark. And 72 years of grit in his bones. He reached for his pencil and whispered again, like a promise, "Why wait?" Before the spark, before the solar panels, before the shed filled with light again, there was just silence. The kind that clings to the walls of an old house like damp air after rain. Frank Adler had lived in that silence for nearly a decade, wearing it like a second skin. It wasn't always this way. Once, the house was alive with the sound of Marion humming old country songs in the kitchen, the clink of tools in the garage, the muffled sound of Emily's music drifting down the hall from a half-closed bedroom door. That was a lifetime ago. Now, the house spoke in creaks and sighs and the occasional cough from an old man who sometimes forgot he was still here. Mornings were the worst. The ache in his knees reminded him that time wasn't just passing, it was pressing. He'd shuffle to the bathroom, avoid the mirror, and let the shower run too long before stepping in. Breakfast was usually toast. Or not. Coffee was non-negotiable. Black, hot, no sugar. Just the way Marion made it. He still made a second cup sometimes, out of habit, and poured it down the sink before he could remember why it sat untouched. The days passed like that, quiet, slow, and mostly forgettable. He used to be a mechanic. Not a fancy one, not the kind that wore clean uniforms or ran diagnostics on laptops. No, Frank was old school. Grease under the nails, carburetor singing, give it a good listen, kind of mechanic. He ran a shop with 2 bays and a gravel parking lot off Route 58. People trusted him. He knew cars like he knew his own hands. But when Marion got sick, he sold the business. Cancer didn't wait for invoices. And when she passed, something inside him stopped turning. The tools went back in their drawers. The garage door stayed shut. The house shrank. And Emily, well, Emily went to college in Michigan, then moved to Seattle. They talked for a while. Weekly calls turned into monthly ones. Then holidays. Then silence. He didn't blame her. He'd been cold. Withdrawn. On the day of her college graduation, he told her he couldn't come. Said it was too far. Too tiring. Truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of sitting in a crowd of cheering parents, alone, pretending he wasn't half a man without Marion by his side. Emily never said it, but he knew that broke something. Maybe for good. They talked less after that. When she sent the birthday card last week, the handwriting looked unsure, like someone signing something out of obligation. He held on to that card anyway. It sat now on the edge of the table, just within reach. Frank sometimes glanced at it without picking it up. Just looked at the curve of the E in Emily and wondered if she still thought of him as a father, or just as some figure from a life she'd already packed away. It wasn't always this way. Frank once had dreams. Big ones. Not for money or fame, but for impact. Back in the early 90s, when gas prices spiked and smog warnings filled the news, he became obsessed with the idea of a solar-powered RV, something that could travel without harming the earth, that could give families the freedom of the open road without the guilt of carbon. Marion had rolled her eyes at first, called him her hippie grease monkey, but she believed in him. On weekends, they'd sit in the garage, sketching designs on the hood of their old camper van, debating battery capacity versus panel angles, laughing about how the world would catch up someday. He had pages and pages of ideas. He even applied for a small patent once, but it was denied. The battery tech wasn't there. The money wasn't there. Life got in the way. He kept the notebooks anyway, stored them in boxes labeled someday. But someday never came. Not until now. When Elon Musk's voice echoed through that YouTube clip, it wasn't just inspiration, it was confrontation. It forced Frank to look back and ask the hardest question of all: what had he done with the years he was given? He thought of all the times he'd walked past those boxes in the attic, telling himself it was too late. Too complicated. Too silly. He thought of all the men his age who played golf and watched cable news and waited to die without ever questioning if there was still something more. He'd become one of them. And it made him angry. Not at them. At himself. Because once upon a time, he'd been full of fire. He remembered the first time he met Marion. At a 4th of July cookout. She wore red sneakers and a grin that dared him to do something reckless. He'd challenged her to a foot race. Lost. Badly. But she kissed him anyway. That night, they'd driven down an empty road with the windows down, talking about what they wanted from life. He told her he wanted to build something no one else had built. She said she wanted to raise someone who made the world better. They did both. For a while. But time has a way of stealing without you noticing. 1 year you're building a dream. The next, you're repairing the roof. Then suddenly you're sitting in a recliner wondering if it's too late to matter. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in quiet waves. Marian's diagnosis. Selling the shop. Emily moving away. The neighbors changing. The phone ringing less. The news sounding louder. He didn't realize he'd given up until he saw someone else refuse to. Watching Elon talk about colonizing Mars, about failing publicly and unapologetically, about doing things not because they were safe but because they were worth doing, that lit a fuse. Not because Frank wanted to go to Mars. Hell, he barely wanted to leave Ohio. But because it reminded him that the world didn't belong to the young. It belonged to the bold. And boldness wasn't measured in years. It was measured in action. He started slow. Just rereading the notebooks. Then redrawing some of the old schematics. Then ordering that tiny solar kit. Each step felt ridiculous. But also right. Like maybe he was dusting off a version of himself he thought had died with Marian. The man who dreamed. Who tried. Who failed sometimes but never stopped building. He found himself talking to her photo more. Not out loud. Just in glances. As if she was still there, arms crossed, eyebrow raised, waiting to see if he'd finally do something about that wild idea. He missed her so much it hurt. But the pain was different now. Less like a hole. More like a hand on his back, pushing him forward. And so the days began to change. Instead of starting in silence, they started with sketches. Coffee cups were left half-finished as he got lost in design tweaks. He made lists of parts. Looked up battery specs. Even browsed used RV frames on Craigslist. The shed that once felt like a tomb now felt like a cradle, something holding the first fragile pieces of something new. He still didn't know if he could do it. He didn't know if anyone would care. But he knew one thing, he was done waiting. Waiting for time to give him permission. Waiting for his body to feel young again. Waiting for someone to say, it's okay to try. He was done with all of it. He was building again. Not just machines, but meaning. Maybe even a bridge back to Emily. Maybe it was too late for apologies. But maybe it wasn't too late for proof. Proof that he hadn't disappeared. That he still had something to give. That a man in his 70s could still matter, not in memory, but in motion. And that's what kept him going in those early days. Not the idea of success. Not the fantasy of some viral story or TED Talk. But the simple, stubborn belief that he wasn't finished. That he still had a say in how his story ended. And that maybe, just maybe, the part after 72 could be the most important chapter of all. It started with the pain. That slow, dragging ache in his back that felt like someone had hooked a chain to his spine and tugged gently, just enough to make every movement remind him he wasn't 30 anymore. Frank ignored it, at first. Just another aging nuisance. But the next morning, when he bent over to pick up a dropped wrench and felt a pop in his side, he gritted his teeth and dropped to a knee. He sat in the shed for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete floor, wondering what he was even doing. What the hell was a 72-year-old man doing out here in a freezing garage, trying to wire solar panels like he was part of some tech startup? His hands were slower, his eyesight worse, and the tools in his hand felt heavier than they had 20 years ago. For a moment, the doubt crept in, quiet, cruel, and familiar. What was the point? He already missed a doctor's appointment last week. Hadn't returned Emily's last text. Hadn't called Tyler, his grandson, in over a year. Who was he trying to impress? Himself? Some ghost of Marian? Maybe the world didn't care if he built anything. Maybe he was just trying to outrun the silence again, and this time, it was catching up. That night, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the face that used to belong to a younger man. The gray had taken over, his skin sagged, his eyes looked like they'd been carrying too much for too long. He rubbed his jaw, felt the stubble, and wondered if he even recognized the person staring back. He remembered what his doctor said a few months ago during his annual checkup, the one he almost skipped. "Frank, you need to slow down. Take it easy. Don't overdo it. At your age, rest is your best medicine." Frank had nodded, but something about the way the doctor said, "at your age," stuck with him like a splinter. As if the moment you crossed some invisible line, the world handed you a chair and told you to sit the rest out. As if your best years had already been lived, and from here on out, you were just a bystander, waiting for the curtain to close. Frank didn't buy that. Not entirely. But on nights like this, when the pain and the loneliness teamed up, it was harder to fight the feeling that maybe the world had already moved on without him. He turned off the light and went to bed without brushing his teeth. That week, the shed stayed dark. The tools untouched. The notebook closed. Instead, Frank sat on the recliner with the TV on, watching news clips he didn't care about, letting the noise fill the space where ideas used to live. Every time he passed the garage window, he looked away. On Friday, the mail came late. A few bills. A flyer for a funeral home offering pre-need consultations. And a tech catalog addressed to Frank Adler, past customer. It featured electric scooters, home lifts, and ergonomic chairs, each one a reminder that society saw him as a walking expiration date. He tossed it in the trash and stood by the can for a long time, hands clenched, jaw tight. That night, out of sheer boredom, he pulled up a video on his laptop. It was one of those long interviews, Elon Musk sitting down with some young tech guy, talking about AI, risk, Mars, and the future. Frank wasn't really listening at first. Until Elon leaned back in the chair, laughed, and said something that made Frank's heart stop. "People think risk ends when you get older. But really, the biggest risk is thinking you're done growing." Frank rewound it. Watched again. "The biggest risk is thinking you're done growing." That line cracked something open. He clicked through more clips. In one, Elon said, "You should take the approach that you're wrong. Your goal is to be less wrong over time." Frank felt something stir again. He wasn't wrong for feeling old. But maybe he was wrong for thinking it meant he had to stop. Maybe it wasn't about getting everything perfect. Maybe it was about trying anyway. Maybe that was the point. He got up, walked to the garage, and flipped on the light. The bulb buzzed. The workbench was just as he'd left it, scattered with half-finished sketches, wires, a battery still taped with notes. He stood there for a long moment, then walked in slowly and picked up his notebook. That night, he didn't build. He just read. Flipped pages. Revisited every scribbled note, every half-baked idea, every margin where Marion had written, "Try a steeper angle here," or, "What about battery cooling?" Her handwriting, messy and looping, made him smile. The next morning, he woke up with purpose. He made a real breakfast, eggs, toast, a single slice of bacon. He even cleaned up after himself. Then he put on his thick coat, grabbed his notebook, and walked to the shed like a man walking into church. The light came on. The heater hummed. He rolled up his sleeves. The first screw slipped. The second wire didn't connect right. The circuit blinked once, then failed. He swore. Laughed. Tried again. On the fourth try, it worked. He stepped back and let the small panel absorb the morning sun through the open door, watched the voltage readout rise ever so slightly. Just enough to know it was working. Just enough to know he was working. That afternoon, a neighbor walked by, Dave, a retired accountant who spent most days walking laps around the block in a sweatsuit. Dave saw the garage door open, stopped, and peeked in. "You fixing something?" Frank didn't look up. "Building something." Dave chuckled. "At our age? What are you building, the fountain of youth? Frank turned, smirked. Just a new future. Dave raised an eyebrow. You trying to be the next Elon Musk now? Frank shrugged. Maybe just the old one. Dave laughed and walked on. Frank turned back to the panel and kept going. That night, after a hot shower and a reheated bowl of stew, he sat at the table and opened a blank sheet in his notebook. At the top, he wrote, Solar RVV2, start here. He filled the page with bullet points: power system, frame rebuild, insulation, battery backup, weight distribution. Ideas came faster now, as if the brain had been unclogged by action. He flipped to a new page and started sketching. The original design had been clunky, too heavy. This time, he knew better. He'd keep it simple, sleek, efficient. Less parts, more purpose. He stayed up past midnight. Didn't feel tired. The next morning, he received a text from Emily. Just one line. Hey Dad. Hope you're okay. Tyler asked about you. He stared at it for a long time. Typed back, I'm okay. Working on something. Tell him I said hi. Then, after a pause, he added, hope you're okay too. She didn't respond. But the message was sent. That was something. Later that week, Frank uploaded his first comment on a YouTube video under a new account, OldWrench72. The video was a young guy building a solar scooter from scratch. Frank wrote, nice build. I'm working on something similar. Used to be a mechanic back in the day. The reply came quick. Right on, Old Wrench. Would love to see what you're building. Frank smiled. He wasn't invisible here. He wasn't just background noise. He mattered. Even if it was just a comment from some stranger, it mattered. He went to bed that night thinking about Mars, not because he wanted to go there, but because someone else believed it was possible. And that belief, that refusal to quit, had reached all the way to a small town in Ohio and lit a fire in a man the world had already started to forget. Frank wasn't done. Not by a long shot. It didn't happen in a blaze of glory or with dramatic music swelling in the background, like in those movies where the old man picks up the hammer again and saves the town. No, for Frank Adler, the change came with something quieter, something far less cinematic, a walk. It was a Wednesday morning, cold but clear, the sky stretched out like steel and the leaves just starting to give up their last bit of color. Frank had spent most of the night revising a wiring diagram in his notebook, and when he woke up, his back was stiff, his legs felt heavy, and his thoughts were cluttered. He shuffled to the window, coffee in hand, and watched as the mailman crossed the street, dropped a few envelopes in his box, and moved on without noticing him. Frank stood there for a while, watching nothing in particular. And then, almost without thinking, he set the coffee down, pulled on his boots, grabbed his coat, and walked outside. Not far. Just to the edge of the driveway. Then he kept going. Down the block. Past the house with the overgrown hedge. Past the shuttered diner with the faded sign. Past the little park where he once pushed Emily on the swings, when she was small and still thought her dad could fix anything. He hadn't taken a real walk in years. Not since Marion passed. Not since the arthritis got worse. Not since the world shrank into the shape of his house. At first, every step felt like a question: why are you doing this, where are you going, what's the point? But then something shifted. His shoulders loosened. His breathing found rhythm. The air smelled like wood smoke and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp and joyful. Frank kept walking. Just a few blocks. No destination. No stopwatch. Just motion. Just proof. Proof that he could still move forward. He walked every day that week. Just a little. And each time, when he got home, he felt clearer. More present. More alive. It became a ritual: wake up, coffee, walk, then shed work. He started carrying a little notepad in his jacket, and ideas came faster when his legs were moving. He'd jot down sketches, part numbers, quotes, thoughts. One page read, charge inverter. Use smaller battery bank. Weight savings convenience. Another just said, maybe add a small window for Tyler. That thought stuck with him. A small window. Maybe with a little bench. Maybe his grandson would ride in this thing someday. Maybe they'd go somewhere together. Maybe they'd talk. He didn't know where that hope came from, but he didn't shut it down either. The change didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, Jess from the hardware store spotted him as she was closing up. "You look different, Mr. Adler," she said. "You building something again?" He nodded. "Trying to." She handed him his change and smiled. "That's cool. Keep going." It was the simplest thing. But it stuck. Keep going. He wrote it on a post-it and stuck it above the workbench. That same night, he went online and created a private blog called Old Dog, New Spark. He didn't tell anyone about it. Didn't advertise it. Just wrote. Short entries. Mostly for himself. October 19th, hooked up the first full panel today. Output not great, but steady. I felt something like pride, but quieter. Like the ghost of pride. October 23rd, watched another Elon Musk interview today. He said, persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. I think I've been giving up without being forced to. October 25th, Emily liked one of my Facebook posts. Just a thumbs up emoji. But I noticed. Made me stare at my screen for longer than I care to admit. The blog became another form of walking. Just in a different direction. Forward, still. Always forward. Meanwhile, the shed began to transform. The clutter was replaced with purpose. The walls were lined with labeled bins, circuit boards, cables, batteries, connectors. The main bench now held a mock-up of the solar grid layout, and on a whiteboard nearby, Frank had written a quote from Musk in thick black marker: "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." That one hit hard. Because for Frank, stagnation had become its own quiet disaster. For years, he'd existed in a kind of emotional coma, eating, breathing, sleeping, but not really living. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was building his way out. One circuit. One walk. One wire at a time. The neighbors began to notice. A few waved. Some just stared. One day, a teenager named Diego, who lived 3 doors down, wandered over and peeked into the open garage. "Yo, Mr. Adler, is that solar?" Frank looked up from his sketchbook. "Yeah. Kind of an old project I'm dusting off." Diego nodded, stepping inside. "That's dope. My science teacher was just talking about solar tech. Said it's the future." Frank smiled. "Guess I'm not completely obsolete, then." Diego laughed. "Nah. You're like, vintage cool." That night, Frank wrote in his blog, "A kid called me cool today. I almost fell over. But it meant something. It meant he was no longer invisible." And maybe that was the biggest shift of all, not the parts, not the panels, not the walks, but the simple, undeniable return of relevance. He mattered. Again. Maybe still. One afternoon, while organizing his old receipts, Frank found the last birthday card Marion ever gave him. It was tucked inside a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The cover had a cartoon of an old man in a cape, flying. Inside, she'd written, "You've always been my superhero. Don't ever forget that your brain is the best engine I know. Build something wild. I'll be watching." He didn't cry. He just sat there, holding the card, feeling the weight of those words. Build something wild. It felt like permission. Like a dare. Like a memory waking up inside him and clapping its hands, saying, "Let's go." The next morning, he walked farther than usual. 3 miles round trip. His knees protested, but he pushed through. When he got home, he drew a new design. Lighter frame. Foldable panels. More efficient inverter. He even found a used lithium battery system online and negotiated the price down by $150. The seller, a younger guy in Chicago, messaged him, "Didn't expect someone named OldWrench72 to know this stuff." Frank replied, "Didn't expect to still be learning it." Later that week, he sent a message to Emily. "Hey kiddo. Working on something I think you might find interesting. Would love to show you sometime." She replied an hour later. "Just one line, I'd like that." He stared at the screen, rereading the words until they became real. Something was changing. Not just inside him. But around him. Through him. Because of him. And it all started with one small, bold choice. A pencil picked up. A switch flipped. A walk taken. One thing changed. And that one thing changed everything. The breakthrough didn't come as a thunderclap. It came quietly, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, when Frank least expected it. The sun was warm but low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the driveway where his half-built solar RV prototype sat. The panels glistened faintly, a mosaic of scratched aluminum and glass, wires snaking beneath like veins feeding some stubborn heart. Frank had been wrestling with the battery inverter for days, the kind of problem that made him want to throw the whole project into the trash and walk away for good. His fingers were scraped, his back ached worse than usual, and the notes in his journal were more despair than hope. But that afternoon, as he tested one more circuit, something clicked. The display on the voltage meter flickered, then settled into a steady, glowing number. The power flow was stable. The system worked. Real power, real energy, real light. Frank leaned back against the workbench, blinking, feeling the rush flood his chest like a fresh breath after drowning for years. He laughed, a deep, shaky laugh, half disbelief, half joy. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was proof. Proof that he could still build. Still create. Still change. Word spread slowly, the way it does in small towns where news isn't shouted but whispered. Jess from the hardware store told a couple of regulars. Diego texted some classmates. Emily forwarded a picture to Tyler. Before he knew it, Frank's little solar RV prototype had made the rounds on social media, under a handle he barely remembered creating, OldWrench72. A few comments popped up. Inspiring to see someone your age building tech. Keep it up, Frank. Proof you're never too old to innovate. One message was different, a direct message from a local news producer. Would love to feature your story on our segment about lifelong learning. Are you interested? Frank sat at his kitchen table, the message blinking on the screen like a spotlight. For a moment, old fears crept in. What if I mess it up? What if they think it's a joke? What if no one cares? Then he remembered Elon Musk's words from those interviews. About risk, persistence, and the refusal to quit unless forced. And he typed back, yes. Let's do it. The interview was scheduled for the next week. The day arrived with the kind of nervous energy Frank hadn't felt since college. He dressed carefully, his best shirt and a clean jacket, but still felt like an imposter stepping onto a stage meant for younger, faster, louder people. The news crew arrived, setting up lights, cameras, and microphones in the garage. The bright lens made Frank squint, but he kept his gaze steady. The reporter asked about the project, about why he started building again, about what it meant to him. Frank talked about Marion, about loss, about fear and hope, about finding a reason to keep moving forward. When the cameras stopped rolling, he felt raw but alive. The story aired that evening, a small segment tucked between weather and sports. But the response was immediate. Calls, texts, emails from strangers and neighbors alike. A former engineer who offered to help source parts. A local high school science teacher who invited Frank to speak to her class. Even Tyler sent a message, hesitant but warm, "Proud of you, Grandpa." That night, Frank sat at the kitchen table, looking at the stream of messages on his phone. He realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: connection. Not just to family, but to community. To a world that still needed him. The breakthrough wasn't just technical. It was emotional, spiritual, real. It was the moment he stopped running from age and started running toward possibility. The next day, Diego showed up with a box of donated parts, batteries, wires, connectors, all from kids at school inspired by Frank's story. Frank couldn't stop smiling. He invited Diego in, and together they tinkered, fixed, improved. Frank saw in Diego the same spark he felt in Elon Musk's voice: restless curiosity, fearless tinkering, relentless hope. The shed became a workshop, a classroom, a bridge between generations. Frank began teaching weekly sessions for neighborhood kids, sharing everything he knew about solar power and engineering, but also about persistence, failure, and courage. At one session, a girl named Mia asked, "Why do you keep building even when it's hard?" Frank looked at her, saw his younger self reflected back, and said, "Because giving up means you never get to see what's possible." The words hung in the air like a promise. Frank's story spread beyond the small town. A podcast host invited him to share his journey on a national platform. A nonprofit reached out, offering a grant to help develop his solar RV into a community project for senior citizens. Invitations to speak at conferences and workshops followed. Through it all, Frank stayed grounded. He still walked every morning, still tinkered in the shed, still kept the blog updated with honest reflections on fear, joy, and the challenges of change. One evening, as he watched a new interview with Elon Musk on his laptop, he paused when Elon said, "If something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank closed the laptop and smiled. That was his new mantra. Importance over odds. The solar RV prototype evolved, becoming lighter, smarter, more efficient. Tyler visited more often now, sometimes bringing friends who were fascinated by their grandpa's project. Emily stopped by with photos of her new job, and Frank realized the distance between them was shrinking, not growing. One day, Frank received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a foundation that supported aging innovators. They wanted to feature his story in their annual report, celebrating people who refused to let age define their limits. Frank reread the letter several times. A stranger in New York had noticed his work, had seen value in his story, in his persistence. He wrote back with gratitude, but also with a question: what's next? The answer came quickly. Frank had begun dreaming of a small mobile unit, a solar-powered shelter that could travel to communities in need, providing clean energy and a space for learning. He sketched it on paper, shared it with Tyler, and together they started planning. The vision grew bigger than the shed. Bigger than the driveway. Bigger than the town. It was about legacy. About possibility. About a future that didn't stop at 72. On a chilly fall morning, Frank stood outside the shed, watching the sunrise paint the sky in oranges and pinks. He felt the familiar ache in his back, the stiffness in his knees, but it didn't stop him. Because now, pain was just a reminder he was still here. Still fighting. Still building. The breakthrough wasn't a finish line. It was the start of a race he never knew he could run. And he was ready to run it all the way. Frank stood on the porch of his modest home, the crisp autumn breeze brushing past his weathered face as the last leaves clung stubbornly to the branches above. The morning sun stretched thin shafts of light across the small town he'd lived in for decades, a place that had once felt like a cage but now, strangely, felt like a canvas. For years, Frank had been invisible, a ghost of himself wandering the halls of memories and missed chances. But something had shifted. Something powerful. He had discovered a spark, fueled by an unlikely source, the relentless spirit of a man named Elon Musk, who refused to accept limits, who dared to change the world no matter the odds or the age. Frank's solar RV prototype was no longer just a project in a dusty garage. It was a symbol of what was possible when fear gave way to hope, when isolation was replaced by connection. Standing there, breathing in the cold air and the faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, Frank thought about legacy. Not the kind written in stone or recorded in fame, but the legacy of purpose. Of showing up when it mattered. Of building something that outlasted you. His journey had come full circle. The walks that once felt like tiny rebellions against his fading spirit had transformed into daily rituals of renewal. The blog that started as a private notebook had become a voice, a quiet beacon for others who felt lost in the shuffle of age and change. Even Emily and Tyler, his children who had once doubted his energy and ideas, had begun to see him anew, not as a relic of the past but as a pioneer of his own future. The community had embraced him. Kids like Diego and Mia flocked to his shed-turned-workshop, their eyes bright with curiosity and admiration. They weren't just learning about solar panels and circuits, they were learning about resilience, about daring to start again no matter how many times life knocked you down. Frank's heart swelled with a fierce kind of pride, the pride of a man who had once thought his best days were behind him, only to find they were just beginning. He had a letter in his pocket, an invitation to speak at a regional conference on aging and innovation. A chance to share his story, to challenge the narrative that growing old meant fading away. That invitation was more than an event, it was a confirmation that his voice mattered, that his journey could ignite others. Frank recalled the words Elon Musk had said during an interview, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That truth had anchored him when doubt crept in. It had driven him to take the first step, to build the first circuit, to send the first message to Emily. And it would drive him forward now. As he prepared for the conference, Frank found himself reflecting on the moments that had shaped this new chapter, moments of struggle, moments of small victories, moments of raw vulnerability. He remembered sitting alone in his kitchen, staring at the empty chair where Marion used to sit, wondering if he had the strength to keep going. He remembered the nights filled with frustration, the days when his body betrayed him, and the times when the world seemed to have forgotten he existed. But most of all, he remembered the moment he discovered Elon Musk's interview. How a man decades younger, racing toward Mars and electric cars, had given him permission to believe in possibility again. Frank realized that legacy wasn't about grand achievements or public accolades. It was about the quiet courage to rewrite your story, to defy the expectations placed on you by age or circumstance. It was about showing up, every day, with intention and heart. At the conference, Frank stepped onto the stage with a mix of nerves and determination. The room was filled with faces eager to hear stories of transformation, of hope, of reinvention. He shared his journey, the long nights of doubt, the small victories of progress, the unexpected kindness of neighbors and strangers. He spoke of Elon Musk, not as a hero to worship, but as a symbol of fearless persistence and radical imagination. He urged the audience to see aging not as an end but as a new frontier. To embrace change, to keep building, to refuse invisibility. The applause that followed was not just polite, it was electric. It carried the weight of shared understanding and newfound inspiration. Back home, Frank's solar RV was nearing completion, and he felt a surge of anticipation. This project was no longer just about power or innovation, it was about connection. About bridging generations, about lighting up lives beyond his own. He pictured taking the RV to schools, community centers, even nursing homes, bringing clean energy and stories of hope wherever he went. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the stars emerge, his phone buzzed with a video call from Emily. She smiled brightly, her eyes reflecting the excitement of new beginnings. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking about your project. What if we partnered with that nonprofit I work with? We could expand the solar RV idea, make it a mobile learning center. Frank's heart lifted. That sounds amazing, Emily. Let's do it. It was more than collaboration, it was healing. Their relationship was evolving from distance to partnership, fueled by shared purpose. That night, Frank wrote in his blog, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." Those words echoed like a mantra, a testament to the journey from despair to hope. The legacy he was building wasn't just about technology or innovation, it was about reclaiming identity, about proving that the fire inside doesn't dim with age unless you let it. In the quiet moments before sleep, Frank reflected on the road ahead. The challenges would be many, the skeptics, the setbacks, the aches of time. But he felt ready. Because he had learned that the greatest innovation was not the solar panels or circuits, it was the courage to start again. To keep dreaming. To build a tomorrow that included everyone, no matter their age. As the night deepened, Frank looked up at the stars, imagining rockets soaring past the moon, just as Elon Musk dreamed. He whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." And with that, he closed his eyes, filled with the promise of a future still waiting to be written. Frank's life had been a slow drift, a quiet surrender to the years that crept up and whispered, "It's time to stop." His days blended into one another like faded photographs, edges worn and colors dulled by time. The house felt emptier after Marion's passing, and the silence echoed in the rooms where laughter once lived. His children had moved on with their busy lives, leaving behind only the occasional call or brief visit, reminders that distance was growing, not just in miles, but in heart. He felt invisible, forgotten by a world racing toward the future with no room for someone like him. One morning, Frank sat alone in his worn leather chair, the morning sun cutting through the curtains and casting a pale glow over his hands resting on his knees. He stared out the window at the quiet street, watching the neighborhood wake up without him. The thought crossed his mind, is this all there is now? The weight of regret pressed down. The dreams never chased, the friendships faded, the words never spoken. He reached for the remote and turned on the TV, not expecting much. But then, an interview caught his attention. Elon Musk was speaking, not about rockets or electric cars this time, but about resilience and the refusal to accept limits. Elon's voice was calm but charged with conviction, no matter how old you are, the key is to keep pushing boundaries. If you're not failing sometimes, you're not trying hard enough. Frank felt a flicker inside, a faint spark amid the ashes of his resignation. The words resonated deep, stirring something he thought long dead. That day marked the moment it all changed. The following weeks were a blur of newfound energy and restless determination. Frank dug through old boxes, pulling out tools and dusty blueprints from his days as an amateur inventor. He reconnected with Diego, the curious teen from down the street who had always admired his tinkering. Together, they brainstormed ideas for a solar-powered project that could light the way forward, both literally and figuratively. The community began to notice the change. The old man who had once seemed resigned was now a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of reinvention. At the local coffee shop, neighbors stopped him to ask about his work, inspired by his tenacity. Even his children grew intrigued, their skepticism softening as they witnessed their father's transformation. Yet, the road was far from easy. Frank grappled with physical pain, doubt, and the fear that his efforts might amount to nothing. He faced setbacks that tested his resolve, failed prototypes, harsh words from those who said he was wasting time, and moments when the past threatened to pull him under. But Elon's words echoed in his mind, a mantra to keep moving forward. Frank knew that change didn't happen overnight. It was forged in persistence, in embracing failure as a step toward success. Slowly, the solar RV prototype took shape, a symbol of what could be when passion met purpose. Each bolt tightened, each wire connected, was a victory against the fading light of age. One evening, Frank sat with Emily and Tyler, sharing his vision and inviting them to be part of the journey. Their eyes lit up with a mixture of pride and surprise, bridging the gap that had grown too wide for years. The moment was fragile but powerful, a family beginning to heal through shared hope. As the prototype neared completion, Frank realized that the project was more than a technical challenge. It was a rebirth, a statement that life could still be vibrant, full of possibility, no matter the years behind you. When the first successful test run powered the RV's lights and small appliances, Frank felt a surge of triumph that words couldn't capture. It was more than electricity flowing through circuits, it was life flowing back into his spirit. That night, he wrote in his journal, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The story of Frank and his solar RV began to spread beyond the small town. Local news picked it up, then podcasts, then social media. People resonated with his courage, his refusal to fade quietly. Invitations came for talks and workshops, and Frank embraced each as a chance to inspire others who felt stuck or forgotten. Through it all, Elon Musk remained a symbol, not a savior, but a spark. That showed Frank and others that age was not a cage but a challenge to be met head-on. Frank's journey was a living proof that transformation was possible, no matter the starting point. On a cool spring morning, as Frank stood beside the nearly finished RV, a letter arrived from a foundation supporting aging innovators. They wanted to feature him in their annual report, celebrating his story as a beacon of hope. Frank smiled, feeling the weight of recognition but more importantly, the affirmation that his work mattered. Standing there, with the rising sun casting long shadows, Frank understood something vital: his story was no longer just his own. It was part of a larger narrative about resilience, reinvention, and the courage to break through barriers. It was about building a new legacy, one not measured by age, but by the fire within. And as he looked up at the vast sky, imagining the stars Elon Musk reached for, Frank whispered a quiet promise to himself: this is only the beginning. Frank woke up that morning with a knot in his stomach, a heaviness that had settled deep in his chest over the past few weeks. The solar RV was almost ready for its first public demonstration, and yet a voice inside whispered doubt, louder than ever. Is it too late for me to really make a difference? Who am I fooling? Why bother when the world is already moving too fast? The questions clashed in his mind, relentless as a storm. He had battled loneliness and invisibility for years, but now, the hardest battle was the one within himself. Sitting at the kitchen table, Frank scrolled through news articles and social media posts about Elon Musk's latest ventures, SpaceX launches, Tesla breakthroughs, Neuralink's promises. Elon seemed unstoppable, a symbol of radical possibility. But Frank couldn't help but wonder if the gap between them was too wide. Elon was young, dynamic, a billionaire with endless resources. Frank was 72, with creaky joints, limited funds, and a lifetime of what-ifs weighing him down. He felt like a tiny boat lost in a vast, stormy ocean of progress. Frank's phone buzzed, a text from Emily: "Dad, don't forget to breathe. You're doing something incredible." He smiled weakly, grateful but still overwhelmed. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the distant hum of life outside. Memories surfaced, times when his own parents had told him to slow down, to accept his age gracefully. Times when doctors had cautioned him to take it easy. The world, it seemed, expected him to fade. To settle. To be a spectator, not a player. But that wasn't who Frank was, or wanted to be. He glanced at a framed photo of Marion on the mantel. Her smile was gentle but fierce, a reminder that life was precious, and time was short. He thought about the words Elon had spoken during an interview: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Those words echoed louder now. Frank realized the fight wasn't just about technology or public recognition. It was a war for his own belief in himself. Could he overcome fear and doubt? Could he rise above the voices telling him he was too old, too slow, too irrelevant? He remembered the times he'd felt invisible in his own family, the subtle sighs when he proposed ideas, the polite but dismissive nods. The battle was real and painful. Frank's phone rang. It was Tyler. "Hey, Grandpa," Tyler said, voice warm but cautious. "Mom and I have been talking. We want to help with the solar RV project. Maybe even get involved ourselves." Frank's heart lifted. "That means a lot, Tyler. I know you've been struggling with whether this makes a difference. But it does. To us. To the community. To me." The conversation eased some of the storm inside Frank, but the inner war persisted. That evening, Frank sat in his workshop, surrounded by tools and blueprints, the smell of solder and metal thick in the air. He thought about Elon's relentless drive, how he faced failure after failure, how he risked everything again and again. Elon's story wasn't just about triumph, it was about resilience in the face of relentless odds. Frank realized he could choose to see his own struggles the same way, not as reasons to quit, but as proof that he was still trying. The next day brought a new challenge. During a routine check, a key component of the solar RV failed, setting back progress by days. The frustration welled up like a tidal wave. Frank wanted to give up, to accept the quiet resignation of age. But instead, he took a deep breath and called Diego, who came over right away. Together, they worked late into the night, problem-solving, learning, laughing through the setbacks. The shared effort reminded Frank that he wasn't alone. He had a team, a purpose, a reason to fight. At the local community center, Frank attended a town meeting about funding for senior programs. He listened as some voiced skepticism about investing in aging innovators, labeling it a pipe dream. The sting of dismissal was sharp, but Frank stood and spoke, his voice steady but passionate. Innovation doesn't stop at a certain age. It grows with experience and the courage to keep going. Some nodded, some shifted uncomfortably. But seeds had been planted. That night, Frank journaled, "The hardest battle isn't against the world, it's within. But I'm learning to stand my ground." The inner war was far from over, but Frank was no longer hiding. He faced each day with a mixture of vulnerability and defiance, knowing that the fight itself was proof of life and purpose. And as he prepared for the solar RV's debut, he carried with him the quiet conviction that age was not a limitation, it was a new frontier to conquer. The journey was just beginning. The morning light streamed through the garage windows, casting a golden glow on the solar RV prototype that sat humming softly, a testament to months of persistence and late nights. Frank stood beside it, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. This wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol, of refusal to fade, of reclaiming purpose, of rewriting what it meant to grow old. He remembered the day he decided to take that first bold step, the day he stopped asking, "Is it too late?" and started asking, "What can I change today?" That small decision, inspired by Elon Musk's relentless drive to tackle impossibility, had transformed his life. He'd begun walking every morning, rekindling strength in his aging body. He'd opened a blog, sharing his journey honestly, and found a community who saw themselves in his struggles and triumphs. He'd reached out to Emily and Tyler, bridging years of silence with shared purpose. But the biggest change was the solar RV, the project born not just from curiosity but from a fierce desire to make a tangible difference. It had started as a hobby, a way to reclaim control over his fading days, but it quickly grew into something bigger. Frank realized that purpose wasn't a distant dream reserved for the young, it was available to anyone willing to act. The RV was equipped with solar panels, energy-efficient appliances, and a small workshop space designed to travel to communities without reliable electricity. It was a rolling beacon of sustainability, education, and hope. Diego and Mia, the local teens who had become Frank's apprentices, helped paint bright murals on the RV's sides, images of the sun, stars, and rockets that hinted at boundless possibility. The day of the first public demonstration arrived, and a crowd gathered in the town square, drawn by curiosity and the promise of something new. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he stepped up to the microphone, the RV glowing softly behind him. He spoke not just about technology but about resilience, about refusing to accept the limits society often placed on age. His voice cracked with emotion as he shared his story, the losses, the doubts, the spark that had reignited his spirit. The crowd listened, many with tears in their eyes. Emily and Tyler stood beside him, their presence a testament to the healing power of purpose and connection. After the demonstration, community members lined up to ask questions, to volunteer, to share their own stories of reinvention. Frank realized that this small act, building the solar RV, was a catalyst for something greater. It was a message that age was not an ending but a beginning. The project expanded quickly, supported by donations, grants, and partnerships. Frank found himself invited to schools, senior centers, and conferences to share his journey. Each story he told inspired others to take their own small steps toward change. One afternoon, as Frank helped Diego install a new solar panel, he noticed the boy's eyes shining with excitement. "I want to do this for a living someday," Diego said. "You showed me that it's never too late to start." Frank smiled, feeling a swell of pride. That was the real legacy, passing on hope and courage to the next generation. Late at night, Frank reflected on the transformation inside himself. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of fear and frustration, setbacks and solitude. But by changing just one thing, his mindset, his willingness to act, he had unlocked a world of possibility. He thought about Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That truth had carried him through the darkest hours and fueled every small victory. Frank knew the road ahead would have challenges. But he was ready now, armed with purpose, surrounded by community, and driven by the belief that his best days were still ahead. The solar RV was more than a project, it was a movement. A movement born from one man's refusal to accept that aging meant giving up. And as the sun set over the town, casting long shadows that mingled with the glow of the RV's solar lights, Frank whispered to himself, "This is the one thing I changed." And it changed everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming lilacs from the neighbors' gardens as Frank stood before the modest crowd gathered at the community center. His hands, once trembling with uncertainty, now gripped the microphone with quiet confidence. The solar RV sat gleaming in the background, its solar panels reflecting the sunlight like a beacon of hope. Frank felt the weight of months of effort resting on this moment, the culmination of doubts, setbacks, and relentless perseverance. As he began to speak, his voice wavered, not from fear, but from the raw emotion of breaking through years of silence and invisibility. He shared stories of loss and loneliness, of the small decisions inspired by Elon Musk's example that reignited his purpose. The crowd listened intently, their eyes glistening with empathy and admiration. For many, Frank's journey mirrored their own struggles with aging, feeling overlooked, doubting their value, questioning the future. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, but for Frank, the true victory was in the faces before him, faces reflecting hope, courage, and renewed belief. After the event, people approached with tears and smiles, thanking Frank for reminding them that it wasn't too late to rewrite their stories. One woman, a retired teacher named Clara, shared how she'd been inspired to start painting again after decades. Another man, Jim, spoke of finally enrolling in a class he'd always wanted to take. These moments of connection underscored the ripple effect of Frank's breakthrough. Back at home, Frank sat alone in his favorite chair, the hum of the evening settling around him. He opened his journal and wrote, "Today was more than a presentation. It was a reclamation of life." Yet, even in this triumph, vulnerability lingered. The fear of fading away still whispered in quiet moments. But Frank knew now that breakthrough wasn't about eliminating fear, it was about moving forward despite it. The journey was ongoing. That night, a message arrived from Tyler, an invitation to collaborate on a new community project to expand solar-powered technology to nearby towns. The idea was ambitious, but Frank's spirit soared. He saw in it the next step in his mission, to build not just a machine, but a movement. Frank's story caught the attention of a local reporter, whose article painted a vivid picture of resilience and reinvention. The story went viral, sparking conversations far beyond their small town. Emails poured in from strangers sharing their own stories of transformation, seeking advice, and expressing gratitude. Frank was overwhelmed but deeply moved. This wasn't about fame, it was about belonging to something larger than himself. Encouraged by the momentum, Frank accepted an invitation to speak at a conference on aging and innovation. Standing before a room filled with experts and peers, he spoke candidly about the inner battles, the power of small changes, and the importance of hope. Elon Musk's presence was felt throughout the event, not as a person, but as an idea, a symbol of radical possibility. Frank's words resonated, reminding everyone that innovation was not just for the young, but for anyone willing to dream and act. Returning home, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. The breakthrough had opened doors, but more importantly, it had opened hearts, including his own. He realized that vulnerability was strength, connection was healing, and purpose was the lifeblood of vitality. As Frank prepared for bed, he looked at the photo of Marion once more. "I'm doing this for us, for the life we dreamed of," he whispered. The breakthrough was not an endpoint, but a new beginning. A testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And as the stars twinkled outside his window, Frank knew that his journey, like Elon's rockets, was aimed for the infinite. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as Frank sat on his porch, sipping his morning coffee. The world outside was waking up, but for Frank, the quiet moments before dawn had become sacred, a time to reflect on how far he had come. It hadn't been long ago that he felt invisible, a man fading into the background of a fast-moving world that had no place for him. But now, the air around him felt charged with possibility. His solar RV was no longer just a prototype, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of determination. Frank thought about the journey, the small choices, the moments of doubt, the breakthroughs that had shaped this new chapter. He remembered Elon Musk's words about radical thinking and fearlessness, how those ideas had sparked a transformation inside him. But more than anything, Frank realized that the legacy he was building wasn't about technology or accolades. It was about something deeper, a message to those who felt forgotten or too old to change. Frank's children had come to visit the day before, their faces bright with pride and admiration. They asked questions about the RV, about the blog, about the community projects. For the first time in years, conversations flowed easily, healing old wounds with honest words and shared dreams. Emily even admitted she had been wrong to doubt him, her voice soft with regret and hope. The family's renewed connection was one of the most precious gifts Frank had received. He thought about Marion and how she would have smiled at this reunion, at the way life had unfolded in unexpected ways. Frank's story had begun to inspire others in his town and beyond. Seniors who once believed their best days were behind them were now taking classes, starting businesses, volunteering in ways they never imagined. The solar RV traveled to neighboring towns, bringing light and education to those without reliable electricity. Frank received letters from people across the country, thanking him for showing that age was not a barrier but a new frontier. Late one evening, as Frank updated his blog, he wrote, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." Those words resonated far beyond his small screen, echoing in the hearts of many. Reflecting on his journey, Frank understood that legacy was not about fame or fortune. It was about the impact left in the lives touched, the courage sparked, the hope rekindled. He felt a profound peace knowing that his story could be a light for others walking similar paths. As the stars appeared, twinkling with the same fierce brilliance that had always drawn Elon Musk's gaze toward the cosmos, Frank made a silent promise to keep reaching, keep dreaming, keep building. His journey was far from over. It was a new beginning, one filled with purpose, connection, and the unshakable belief that no one was ever too old to change the world. Frank stood on the edge of the hill overlooking the town, the night sky stretched wide above him like a vast, uncharted ocean. The stars shimmered, distant and mysterious, yet somehow close enough to touch. It was in these quiet moments that he felt the pull of something bigger, a call to reach beyond the familiar, beyond his doubts, beyond the limits others had placed on him. Elon Musk's vision of Mars had always fascinated Frank. Not just the technical marvel of sending rockets beyond Earth's atmosphere, but the audacity of dreaming that big, the refusal to accept boundaries. That vision sparked a fire inside him, a reminder that no matter our age or circumstances, the human spirit was designed to explore, to innovate, to transcend. Frank's own life had become a testament to that spirit. From the solar RV project to reconnecting with family and community, he had journeyed from invisibility to influence, from fear to fearless hope. And now, standing beneath the infinite sky, he dreamed anew. He imagined a future where technology bridged generations, where the wisdom of age met the innovation of youth to solve the world's greatest challenges. He thought about Tyler and Diego, the young apprentices who had brought fresh energy and ideas to the solar RV project. Their enthusiasm reminded him that legacy wasn't just about looking back, but about building forward. Inspired, Frank began sketching ideas for a new initiative, an intergenerational innovation lab that would bring seniors and young people together to collaborate on sustainable technologies. He envisioned workshops filled with laughter and learning, where experience met creativity, where age was an asset, not a barrier. The next morning, Frank shared the idea with Emily and Tyler. Their eyes lit up with excitement and support. "It's brilliant, Dad," Emily said. "This could change everything." They began reaching out to local schools, community centers, and environmental groups, gathering support and resources. The project quickly gained momentum, attracting volunteers and sponsors eager to be part of a movement that celebrated age and innovation. Frank felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched the first workshop take shape, a lively space buzzing with ideas, collaboration, and hope. Seniors taught traditional skills and shared stories, while young people introduced new technologies and perspectives. Together, they worked on solar-powered devices, urban gardens, and sustainable solutions for their town. The lab became a vibrant hub, a place where barriers dissolved, and connections flourished. Frank often thought about Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, how that mindset had transformed entire industries and inspired millions. He realized that innovation wasn't just about technology, it was about mindset, about daring to believe that change was possible, no matter the odds. As the lab grew, so did Frank's sense of purpose. He saw the joy in the eyes of participants, the spark of confidence in their voices, the bonds forming across generations. This was his new mission. To nurture a culture where everyone, regardless of age, could reach for the stars in their own way. One evening, as Frank closed up the lab, he looked up at the night sky once more. The stars seemed brighter than ever, a constellation of possibilities waiting to be explored. He whispered, "Thank you, Elon, for showing me that dreaming big isn't just for the young. It's for anyone willing to try." Frank knew his journey was far from over. The stars were calling, and he was ready to answer. Frank sat alone in his workshop late into the night, the soft hum of the solar RV's battery charger filling the quiet room. The air was thick with the scent of oil and solder, the tangible proof of countless hours spent building, failing, and trying again. Today had been one of those days, a day when a critical component of the RV's power system failed during testing, forcing a halt to progress. The frustration weighed heavily on him, threatening to crush the fragile confidence he had fought so hard to build. But Frank was learning something essential, something Elon Musk knew all too well: failure wasn't the end. It was a necessary step on the path to success. Elon's career had been marked by setbacks, rocket explosions, production delays, public criticism. Yet, time and again, he had risen, fueled by a fierce determination to learn, adapt, and push forward. Frank reflected on his own journey and realized that embracing failure meant shedding the fear that had held him back for so long. It meant seeing mistakes not as proof of inadequacy, but as lessons that paved the way for growth. As the night deepened, Frank pulled out his journal and wrote, "Failure is not the enemy. It is the teacher I've been avoiding." The next morning, Frank called Diego and Mia, the two teens who had become his partners in this mission. "We hit a snag," he admitted. "But that's okay. We'll figure it out." Together, they brainstormed solutions, testing new components, redesigning parts of the system. The atmosphere was electric with creativity and resolve. Frank marveled at the energy and optimism of the young apprentices, who viewed failure as an exciting challenge rather than a setback. Their spirit was infectious. Later that week, Frank shared his thoughts on failure in a blog post that resonated deeply with his growing audience. He wrote about vulnerability, resilience, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the path was uncertain. Responses poured in from readers who saw their own struggles reflected in his words. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me permission to try again, even after so many no's in my life." Encouraged, Frank continued to share not only his successes but also his setbacks, creating a space where imperfection was embraced as part of the human experience. In the Community Innovation Lab, Frank organized a workshop titled "Fail Forward," where participants shared stories of failure and how those experiences had shaped their lives. The room buzzed with honesty and support, breaking down stigma and fear. Frank watched as bonds formed, and self-doubt gave way to empowerment. Meanwhile, the solar RV's repairs were progressing. Each obstacle overcome brought new insights, strengthening the design and deepening Frank's belief in the project's potential. One evening, as he adjusted a solar panel angle, Frank thought about Elon's words from an interview, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Those words became a mantra, a shield against despair. Frank's embrace of failure transformed not just the project but his entire outlook. He felt lighter, freer, more willing to take risks and dream bigger. The fear of being too old to try anything new faded into the background, replaced by a fierce curiosity and passion. As spring turned to summer, the solar RV was ready for another round of testing. This time, the system held steady, powering lights, appliances, and charging devices with clean energy. The victory was sweeter because of the journey, the setbacks, the learning, the resilience. Frank knew there would be more challenges ahead, but now he faced them with a heart emboldened by experience and a spirit fueled by hope. Sitting on his porch that evening, Frank gazed at the stars once more, feeling a profound connection to the pioneers who dared to fail and rise. He whispered to the night, "Thank you for the lessons. I'm ready for whatever comes next." The path of innovation was not smooth, but it was real, alive, and worth every stumble. Frank didn't know why the message from Tyler hit him as hard as it did. It was a simple text, just 9 words, but it stopped him cold. "Can we talk soon? There's something I need." Frank read it again, over and over, pacing in his kitchen with the phone in his hand, his coffee growing cold on the counter. For years, conversations with Tyler had been polite but distant, shallow like puddles. There was love, of course, but it had thinned out under years of unspoken disappointment, awkward visits, and long silences. Frank knew part of that was his fault. He'd been stubborn, proud, and maybe too focused on proving something when Tyler was growing up. And when Marion passed, something in their relationship had gone quiet. Now, after months of slow rebuilding, sparked by the solar RV, the blog, the innovation lab, Tyler's message hinted at something deeper. Frank texted back, "Of course. Come by any time." Tyler arrived just after dusk. Frank watched from the porch as his son pulled up in his old Subaru, headlights sweeping across the front yard. Tyler stepped out, shoulders a little hunched, face tight like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. They sat on the porch for a while, saying nothing. Just watching the stars. It was quiet enough to hear the leaves rustle and the occasional bark of a dog down the street. Then Tyler spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "Dad. I think I'm lost." Frank didn't say anything at first. He waited. Tyler stared out into the dark. I've been working the same job for 12 years. Same routine, same meetings, same problems. I've been asking myself lately, is this it? Is this all I've got in me? Frank felt a familiar ache, because he'd asked himself that very question not long ago. Tyler continued, I used to dream about building something. I studied engineering, remember? I wanted to design clean energy systems, stuff that could actually change lives. But then I took the first job that paid well. And the years just happened. His voice broke a little, and he looked at his father. Watching you the past few months, it messed with me. In a good way. I mean, you're 72 and building solar machines and inspiring people. And I'm 44 and I feel like I've already plateaued. It scares the hell out of me. Frank reached over and put a hand on his son's shoulder. It felt like both a comfort and a reckoning. You know, Frank said, I used to think I missed my shot. I thought I was too old to matter. But what I've learned is, every single day we wake up breathing is a chance to begin again. The clock doesn't own us. Regret doesn't have to define us. What matters is what we choose to do right now. Tyler looked down at his hands. But what if I'm too far off the path to get back? Frank smiled. There is no path. That's the trick. You make your own, one choice at a time. And you start by doing one thing differently. Just one. Tyler took a deep breath. Then maybe I'd like to help out. With the lab. With the RV project. I don't want to just watch anymore. Frank's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something like joy. I'd be honored, he said. That night, after Tyler left, Frank sat in the garage, the solar RV glowing softly in the dark, and thought about how strange and beautiful it was that his own transformation had begun with a video clip of Elon Musk. Not a miracle. Not some grand event. Just an idea, planted like a seed. And now, that idea had spread, to Diego and Mia, to Emily, and now to Tyler. It was as if a quiet fire had caught, warming the corners of lives that had gone cold. Over the next few weeks, Tyler dove into the work with surprising energy. He started helping with the RV's energy systems, ran analytics on solar input, and even led a workshop for the teens in the innovation lab. Watching him light up, truly light up, Frank saw the boy he remembered, curious, driven, fearless. One afternoon, as they installed an upgraded battery module, Tyler turned to Frank and said, I used to look at guys like Elon Musk and think, well, he's just wired differently. Guys like him changed the world. Not me. But now. I think maybe we all have a version of that in us. That courage. That fire. I just forgot how to look for it. Frank nodded, heart full. Yeah. I forgot too. But we remembered. That's what matters. The project took on new life with Tyler involved. Frank found himself learning just as much as he was teaching. And for the first time in decades, he and his son weren't just father and son. They were partners. Collaborators. Friends. One evening, after a long day of testing and troubleshooting, Frank and Tyler sat in the innovation lab long after everyone else had gone. The place was quiet, but alive with the echoes of laughter and learning. Tyler leaned back in his chair and said, you know, when I sent you that text, I wasn't sure you'd even respond. I almost didn't send it. Frank looked at him, eyes kind but firm. Well, I'm glad you did. That message, it changed everything. Tyler smiled. Me too. Outside, the stars blinked above the town, as steady and unreachable as ever. But Frank no longer saw them as distant. They were markers, reminders of what could be reached with enough grit, enough heart, and enough belief in the power of starting again. And somewhere out there, on the tip of possibility, was the future they were building, together, one connection at a time. Frank had always believed that the big moments in life arrived with noise, fireworks, applause, big speeches. But when the world finally noticed what he and his little community had built, it came quietly, almost like a ripple across a still pond. It started with an email that nearly went to spam. The subject line read, "Inquiry, feature opportunity with Futurefront News." Frank didn't know the outlet, but Tyler did. "Dad," he said, holding up his phone with wide eyes, "this is huge. They cover sustainable tech, space, social impact. If they're reaching out to you, that means people are watching. Important people." Frank squinted at the screen, trying to grasp the weight of what Tyler was saying. "What do they want?" "They want to come film a segment about you, the RV, the lab. All of it." Frank blinked. "Me? Yeah. You." The crew showed up 4 days later, 2 camera guys, a producer named Marcy, and a young reporter named Lyle who had clearly done his homework. They didn't want polish or performance. They wanted real. They filmed Frank walking through the innovation lab, pausing beside Diego and Mia as they 3D printed a solar panel bracket prototype. They followed him into the RV, asked him about the wiring, the storage batteries, the efficiency rate of his design. Then they turned the camera off and asked the real question, "Why did you start this?" Frank hesitated, looking into the lens as if it were a mirror. "Because I was disappearing," he said. "Because the world tells people like me to sit down, stay quiet, get out of the way. But I couldn't do that. I didn't want to go quietly. I needed to know I still had something left to give." Lyle didn't respond right away. He just nodded, a deep, respectful silence settling into the room. The piece aired 2 weeks later. It was 8 minutes long. Frank watched it with Emily and Tyler on the couch, holding his breath as images of the RV, the workshops, and the community projects flashed across the screen. But it was the words, his words, that hit hardest. They hadn't edited them much. "I was never too old," he said, voice low and raw, "I just thought I needed permission to matter again." The video exploded. Comments poured in. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. People from every corner of the country, and even some from overseas, shared their stories. Retired mechanics who started tinkering again. Widows who started volunteering. Grandparents who signed up for online classes. It wasn't just admiration, it was motion. Frank had unknowingly lit a fuse, and now it was spreading, fast. News outlets picked up the story. He was invited to speak on podcasts, radio shows, even a live-streamed forum about sustainable aging hosted by a university think tank. They introduced him as a new face of late-life innovation. The phrase made him laugh. He still struggled with his smartphone half the time, but deep down, it felt true. Not because of fame, but because people were finally seeing what he had learned the hard way, that aging wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a new one. The attention brought challenges too. Not everyone believed in what he was doing. Some thought he was being used by tech companies, or accused him of chasing attention. But Frank stayed focused. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't trying to be a celebrity. He just wanted to keep going. The lab doubled in size. Donations flooded in, and with help from Emily and Tyler, they turned an abandoned warehouse downtown into a new HQ. It had classrooms, a fabrication shop, and a media room for documenting and sharing progress. Seniors taught coding. High schoolers taught soldering. Local businesses began hiring from the lab's network. People who had once felt forgotten now had roles, missions, places where they were needed. Frank started a speaker series, free to attend, where anyone, regardless of age or background, could share a story of reinvention. He opened each event with the same phrase, "We're not here to talk about what's ending. We're here to talk about what's beginning." Still, with all the growth and success, Frank remained grounded in the ritual that had started it all, the long walks in the early morning. He often passed the small bench near the river, the place where he'd first read Elon Musk's quote that changed everything: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. He kept a photo of that quote taped to the dashboard of the RV now. A reminder. Not of Elon the billionaire or the inventor, but Elon the idea, the embodiment of impossible odds met with unapologetic belief. One morning, during a walk, Frank noticed something new. Someone had spray-painted a message on the trail's retaining wall. It read, "Start anyway." No signature. No hashtag. Just 2 words. But they punched right through his chest. He stood there a long time, staring at it, and smiled. That afternoon, he mentioned it during a live-stream Q&A with a senior center in Pennsylvania. "Start anyway," he said, holding up a photo of the wall. "Don't wait for the fear to go away. Don't wait for the plan to be perfect. Don't wait for someone to give you permission. Just start. Start where you are. Use what you have. Be who you are. The world needs that." His inbox exploded again. Messages with subject lines like, "I started anyway," and "You made me get off the couch." People were making solar ovens, writing memoirs, rebuilding bicycles, reaching out to estranged siblings, recording lullabies for their grandkids. The world had shown up, not just for Frank, but for itself. It was as if people were just waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to begin again. To believe again. Frank knew that feeling well. It had lived in him for years like a quiet ache. And now, that ache had become a movement. One that didn't need a CEO or a boardroom. Just a spark. Just one person brave enough to stand up and say, "I'm not done yet." That night, Frank sat in his garage, the original lab, alone with his tools, his thoughts, and the hum of his now famous RV. He ran his hand along the smooth side panel, tracing the hand-painted rocket that Diego had drawn back when it was just a dream. And he whispered the same words he'd whispered months ago, when no one was watching. "Thank you. Not to the world. Not to the cameras. But to himself. For starting. For not giving up. For believing there was still more to do." He wasn't finished. Not even close. Frank was tightening a small bolt on the latest upgrade to the RV's inverter system when Emily walked into the lab holding an envelope with a red seal, her expression unreadable. "This came in the mail today," she said, holding it out. "It's official." Frank wiped his hands on a rag, took the envelope, and slowly opened it. Inside was a sleek piece of cardstock, embossed with metallic blue ink, bearing the unmistakable SpaceX logo in the top corner. Beneath it, a single sentence: "You are cordially invited to attend the Innovation and Legacy Summit at Starbase, Boca Chica, Texas. Guest of Elon Musk." Frank froze. For a long moment, he didn't breathe, didn't blink. He just stared at the words like they were written in another language. "This has to be a joke," he said, looking up. Emily shook her head. "It's not. There's a return address. It's real, Dad." Tyler stepped into the lab behind her, grinning. "You've been on their radar for a while. Someone from the summit team called me last week, asking about your background, the lab, the RV, everything." Frank set the envelope down gently on the workbench as if it might explode. "Elon Musk invited me." "Not just you," Tyler said. "They want you to speak. You're on the program. 3rd day. Main stage." The world tilted for a moment. Frank sat down on the nearby stool, heart thumping. "Starbase. Texas. Elon. I'm just a guy from Ohio," he muttered. "I built a solar RV in a garage. I run a small-town lab with some teenagers and retirees." "Exactly," Emily said, eyes glowing. "That's why they want you. Because you're proof that innovation isn't just coming from Silicon Valley or Wall Street. It's coming from porches and garages and people who refuse to be sidelined." Frank didn't sleep much that night. He walked the floor of the lab, then the porch, then the living room, his thoughts churning. He wasn't afraid of public speaking. Not anymore. He wasn't worried about the travel or the attention. What kept him up was something else entirely. Was he worthy of standing on that stage? Of sharing space with some of the most visionary minds on the planet? In the middle of the night, he found himself watching old clips of Elon Musk. Early interviews, faltering presentations, nervous TED Talks from decades ago. In them, he didn't see a billionaire or a celebrity. He saw a man wrestling with ideas too big for comfort, too bold for most people to understand. Elon wasn't smooth or perfect. But he was relentless. And in that, Frank found his answer. The next morning, he confirmed his attendance. 2 weeks later, Frank found himself standing in the vast, sun-soaked expanse of Starbase, Texas, where steel rockets towered like futuristic cathedrals against the sky. The air buzzed with possibility, and the ground seemed to hum with history being written in real time. He'd brought Emily and Tyler with him, both of whom acted as his anchors in this world of cutting-edge tech and forward-thinking leaders. The summit was massive. Entrepreneurs, scientists, thinkers, artists, astronauts, students, it was a living mosaic of innovation. Everyone wore name tags, but Frank's drew attention. People recognized him from the viral video. Some called him the Solar Grandpa. Others asked about the RV, the lab, the blog. A few just shook his hand and said, "Thank you." On the third day, Frank stood backstage, microphone clipped to his shirt, watching the countdown timer as the moderator introduced him. Up next is a man whose story has inspired millions. He didn't come from a lab or a tech firm. He came from a quiet town in Ohio, where he reminded us that purpose has no expiration date. Please welcome Frank Mullins. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was warm, generous, not for a celebrity, but for a kindred spirit. Frank looked out at the crowd. The lights were bright, but he could make out rows of faces, young and old, curious and attentive. He began, "I used to believe that getting older meant getting smaller. Quieter. Like life was something that shrank around you, inch by inch, until one day you just stopped being noticed. I believed that for a long time. Until one day, I didn't." He told them about the long walks, about losing Marion, about the bench by the river and the quote that broke something open inside him. He talked about failure and loneliness, about the decision to build something, not because he knew he could, but because he knew he had to try. He spoke about the community lab, the teenagers, the partnerships, and the message that had spread far beyond his imagination. He paused, looked down for a breath, then said, "I didn't do this because I wanted recognition. I did it because I needed to matter again. And what I've learned is that the moment you decide you still have something to give, the world has a way of showing up to meet you." The silence that followed was deep, not empty, but full. Then the crowd rose in a standing ovation that felt like it would never end. Frank didn't cry, not then. But his hands trembled slightly as he walked off stage. Backstage, he was greeted by a familiar voice. That was powerful. Frank turned. Elon Musk stood there, casual in jeans and a black SpaceX hoodie, eyes sharp and curious. "Thank you," Frank said, offering his hand. Elon shook it firmly. "I've followed your story. What you built, it's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Not just in tech. In culture. In how we age. In how we live." Frank laughed nervously. "You're the reason I started. That quote of yours, about doing things even if the odds are against you, it was like a spark. I didn't even know I was waiting to hear it." Elon nodded. "Most people are. Waiting for permission. Waiting for proof they won't fail. But that's not how anything great happens." They talked briefly about the RV, about scaling the lab, about the unexpected places innovation shows up. Then Elon said something that Frank would carry with him forever. You proved something powerful. That legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. And you're not done yet. Later, as Frank sat outside on the dunes near the launch pad, the sun dipping below the wide Texas horizon, he thought about how far he'd come. Not just in miles. In belief. In purpose. He thought about the people back home, the ones still sitting on porches wondering if they mattered. He thought about the ones who had already started, inspired by his story. And he thought about what came next. Because Elon was right. He wasn't done yet. Frank had always believed that the real test of any experience wasn't what happened during the moment, but what lingered afterward, what followed you home, clung to your thoughts, and shifted your path forward. As the plane left the flat, sun-baked land of Texas behind and soared back toward Ohio, Frank sat by the window watching the clouds roll beneath him, heart still catching up with the events of the past few days. The summit had been surreal. Starbase was unlike any place he'd ever seen, an intersection of imagination and steel, where dreams were drawn not on paper but in carbon fiber and flame. And standing beside Elon Musk, talking about reinvention, late-life innovation, and human potential, had felt like looking in a mirror that reflected not what he was, but what he was becoming. But now came the return. The real world. The RV. The lab. The small town that had once felt like a place to fade away and now stood as a launch pad for something far bigger. Emily glanced over at him from across the aisle. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking. About the speech? About everything. You crushed it, Dad. Seriously. You should have seen the reactions online. Everyone's sharing it. You've got over 1 million views already." Frank blinked. 1 million? People are calling you the voice of the new second act. Frank shook his head, chuckling softly. That's a long way from a retired machinist fixing lawnmowers. "Yeah," Emily said, smiling. "But you're not just fixing machines anymore. You're fixing people's belief in themselves." The plane landed just before sunset, casting golden light over the familiar patchwork of fields and roads. As Frank stepped off, he took a deep breath of the humid Ohio air. It smelled like earth and memory. Tyler was waiting at the curb, grinning. "Rock star returns," he called out, clapping Frank on the back. "I think you broke the internet, old man." "I just told the truth," Frank said, tossing his duffel into the back of the truck. Turns out people were ready to hear it. Back at the house, everything looked the same but felt different. The porch light still flickered. The front door still stuck. The same ticking clock echoed through the kitchen. But Frank moved through it all with a new energy, not manic, not frantic, just steady. Focused. Over the next few days, he returned to the lab and found it humming with energy. A group of high school seniors were building a wind-powered generator. A retired teacher was leading a storytelling workshop for kids. And Diego and Mia had drafted a proposal to expand the solar RV project into a fleet, mobile learning labs that could travel to rural areas and underserved neighborhoods. Frank listened carefully, encouraged ideas, offered suggestions. He didn't need to control every detail anymore. He had become something else now, not just a builder, but a catalyst. A connector. That week, a handwritten letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Just a neat cursive script on a cream-colored envelope. Frank opened it slowly. Inside was a short note, "Mr. Mullins, my name is Harriet. I'm 83 years old. I watched your speech from Starbase. I cried through the whole thing. I didn't know I was waiting for someone to tell me I still had time. Yesterday, I signed up for a digital art class. I'm terrified and thrilled. Thank you for reminding me I'm not finished." Frank stared at the letter, heart aching in the best way. He pinned it to the wall above his workbench, right beside the quote from Elon. The days that followed were full. Full of meetings. Full of mentorship. full of visitors. People began showing up from other towns, even other states. Curious neighbors. Journalists. Aspiring inventors. Retired workers with ideas but no place to try them. Frank welcomed them all. He remembered what it had felt like to stand on the edge of too late. He knew that look in their eyes. The hunger to believe again. And so he did what Elon had done for him, he passed the spark. One night, as Frank walked out behind the lab, he stood at the edge of the cornfield, the wind gentle and warm. The sky above was wide and full of stars. He thought about how far he'd traveled, not in miles, but in meaning. From the quiet of grief to the noise of purpose. From sitting alone on a park bench to standing on a stage at Starbase. From wondering if he mattered to knowing he did. He still remembered that first moment of doubt, that first step toward change. He remembered the weight of loss, of aging, of invisibility. And now, all of that had become fuel. He'd learned that transformation didn't require perfection or youth. It required one decision, to begin anyway. The solar RV sat parked outside the lab, glinting in the moonlight like a ship waiting for its next voyage. Frank ran his fingers along the edge of the door, then turned and walked home. He felt no rush. No panic. No pressure to do anything big. Just peace. Purpose. A deep knowing that the road home wasn't the end. It was simply another beginning. Because when you finally remember you have something left to give, the world has a way of giving you everything you need to keep going. It was early spring when the first of the mobile labs finally rolled out of the garage. Frank stood with Tyler and Diego beside the gleaming vehicle, a reimagined RV built on the same skeleton as his original but expanded, smarter, and equipped with fold-out solar wings, digital workstations, and a modular interior that could switch between a classroom, a tech lab, and a community center. On its side, hand-painted by Mia, was a mural of Earth viewed from the moon, with the words "We begin where we are" scrawled in bold, stylized lettering underneath. It was more than just a mobile unit, it was a message on wheels. A belief turned into something that moved. A statement that no place, no person, was too small to matter. Frank circled it slowly, running his hand along the paneling, checking every detail. Even now, with all that had happened, he couldn't help it. He was a builder. And what he'd helped build here felt like nothing short of a new kind of rocket, not one that flew to space, but one that carried forgotten people back into orbit. Back into the conversation. Back into belief. Tyler tossed him the keys. "You're driving," he said. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "Dead sure. It started with you. You should be the one to take her out." Frank climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The hum of the electric motor was smooth and low, barely louder than the wind. He looked in the rearview mirror at the faces behind him, young and old, excited and nervous. A few reporters followed in cars. A drone hovered above, streaming the moment live to the project's growing online audience. As he pulled away from the garage, he didn't feel like a retiree. He didn't feel like a man in his 70s. He felt like a pioneer again. Their first stop was a small rural town 2 hours away, a forgotten patch on the map, the kind of place where factories had closed decades ago and never reopened, where dreams seemed to dry out in the silence. The mobile lab parked in the lot of an old church, and within 20 minutes, the fold-out panels were deployed, the workstations set up, and curious locals began to gather. Frank watched as a 10-year-old girl and her grandfather used a tablet to simulate solar energy output. He watched as a young mother asked questions about 3D printing, and a former electrician in his 60s showed a group of teenagers how to wire a circuit. He watched people come alive. All he'd done was bring the tools. They'd brought the fire. That night, after the lab packed up, Frank sat in the RV, watching the stars overhead. Tyler joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Feels different out here," Tyler said. "Like we're not just building things. We're unearthing people's purpose. Frank nodded. There's something about showing up with something new, something they haven't seen before. It's not just the tech. It's the fact that someone thought they were worth visiting. Worth investing in. Like what Elon did with you. Exactly. Frank sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the horizon. This isn't about replacing the past. It's about making room for what's next. For everyone. No matter how old. No matter how far off course they think they are. Over the next 6 weeks, the mobile lab visited 12 towns. They ran workshops in parking lots, fields, schools, and libraries. Each stop brought new faces, new ideas, and new proof that the hunger to contribute didn't disappear with age, it just needed permission to resurface. One day, in a lakeside town with a population barely over 400, a woman in her late 70s approached Frank after a solar demonstration. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and thick glasses, and her hands trembled slightly as she held onto a walker. "I watched your Starbase talk," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to say what you said for 50 years. Frank tilted his head. "And what was that?" "That I'm not done." She grinned. "I used to write code. Back when punch cards were a thing. They told me there was no place for me now. But I think they were wrong." Frank offered her his arm. "I know they were." By the time they returned to their home base, the project had gained national attention again. Media outlets covered the mobile lab's progress, calling it a grassroots revolution in accessible innovation. Retired workers across the country wrote in, asking how they could start their own versions. Teachers wanted curriculum guides. Cities wanted partnerships. It was growing faster than anyone expected. But Frank wasn't overwhelmed. Not anymore. He had people now. A team. A mission. A map built from belief. One afternoon, as he walked through the expanded lab, now buzzing with activity from morning to night, he paused beside the original RV, the one that had started it all. It was still intact, lovingly maintained by a group of teen volunteers who had made it their side project. On its dashboard sat the same faded Elon Musk quote he printed out months ago, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." He reached out and touched it gently. "Still true," he whispered. Diego found him there a few minutes later. "Hey, Frank, there's a call for you. From someone at the National Institute for Longevity and Innovation. They want you to keynote their fall summit." Frank smiled. "Put them down as a maybe. We've got another launch next week." As the day wound down, he stood at the edge of the field behind the lab. The sky glowed orange and purple, and in the distance, the faint outlines of the solar panels shimmered in the last light of the day. He felt no rush. No need to chase anything. Just gratitude. For the work. For the people. For the second chance. It was never about being famous. Never about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering that spark, that belief, that aging wasn't a decline, but an evolution. That reinvention didn't belong to the young. It belonged to the brave. And somewhere, out there on the road or sitting quietly in a house like the one he'd once felt invisible in, was another person waiting to start. And when they were ready, he'd be there. Maybe not in person. But in the wheels of a lab. In the words of a blog post. In the quiet fire of an idea that refused to die. Because that's what legacy really was. Not a name etched in stone. But a light passed forward, one soul at a time. Frank never went into the attic unless he had to. It was the kind of place that held more than dust and boxes, it held memories, the kind that crept in slow and left heavy. After all the noise of the past few months, summits, launches, speeches, emails, he found himself craving silence. Not the lonely kind he used to fear, but the stillness that comes when you know you're not running anymore. You're just listening. One Saturday morning, he woke before dawn, sat with his coffee in the soft gray light of the kitchen, and looked up toward the ceiling like something had whispered. A nudge, maybe. He grabbed the flashlight and climbed the creaky wooden stairs. The attic smelled the same, old wood, insulation, a faint trace of mothballs. He ducked under a beam, stepping over a box labeled Smaz 98 and another one labeled Marion's Things. That's the one that stopped him. It had been almost a year since he'd really gone through any of her things. He'd always felt like it would be too painful, like he'd be pulling loose a thread he wasn't ready to untangle. But now, with everything that had happened. With the lab, the mobile project, the people writing from around the world, he felt a little stronger. Maybe even ready. He lifted the lid. Inside were the things he remembered: her favorite wool scarf, a bundle of recipe cards tied with green ribbon, a photo album with corners taped and retaped. But beneath it all, near the bottom, was a sealed envelope with his name on it in Marion's handwriting. Just Frank. Nothing else. His breath caught. He sat on an overturned crate and held the envelope in both hands for a long time before opening it. The paper inside was cream-colored, her pen flowing in soft, careful curves. The letter was dated 2 months before her passing. Dear Frank, if you're reading this, it probably means I'm gone, and you've finally worked up the courage to go poking through the attic like I always told you not to. So, congratulations. You win. I don't know where you'll be in your life when you find this. Maybe still tinkering. Maybe stuck. Maybe something in between. But I need to say something I never got quite right while I was here. You were never just a man with tools and grease under his nails. You were a builder of hearts, Frank. You didn't just fix things, you gave people reason to believe things could be fixed. Even me. Especially me. I worried about you, after my diagnosis. Not just because I was scared of leaving, but because I wasn't sure you'd believe you were allowed to start over without me. You always had this way of giving everything to everyone else, and nothing to yourself. But you deserve more. So if you ever feel like there's something left for you to do, something wild or strange or beautiful, I hope you'll do it. Even if you're scared. Especially if you're scared. Do it for me. Do it for you. Love you always, M. Frank sat there with the letter in his lap, tears streaking silently down his face. He didn't cry like a man broken. He cried like a man found. Everything she said, every word, was a mirror held up to the journey he'd already begun without even knowing her blessing was waiting in a dusty box above his head. Later that day, he brought the letter down to the lab and pinned it beside Elon's quote and Harriet's note. 3 messages. 3 reasons to keep going. That week, something shifted in him. Not in direction, he was already moving, but in clarity. He realized this was no longer about proving he still had value. He knew that now. This was about legacy. Not the kind that ends with a name on a building. The kind that multiplies. That outlives you. The team had been pushing forward with the fleet expansion. 3 more solar labs were under construction, each based on his original design but modified by the younger engineers, smarter and more efficient. Frank stepped back just enough to let them lead, but close enough to mentor when needed. And then came the idea that stopped him in his tracks. Mia proposed it during one of their evening meetings, surrounded by white boards, pizza boxes, and half-drunk mugs of coffee. What if, she said, eyes shining, we made it possible for people to launch their own labs? Like, a full toolkit. Plans, guides, mentorship. We could call it Launch Kit. Frank sat up straighter. You mean like an open-source playbook? Yes. Like a mission package. Everything they'd need to start, whether they're in Alaska or Arizona. Doesn't matter. They apply, we evaluate, we support. Could be one in every county in the country. Tyler leaned in. That could scale fast. Especially with the visibility you've got now. Retired engineers. Former teachers. Veterans. People with life experience and no platform. Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the whiteboard, then at the faces around him. Every one of them had changed since they began. Not because of him, but because something inside them had been given room to breathe. Do it, he said finally. Build the kit. Make it easy enough for someone like me to use on day one. And put my name on the first one. We'll ship it ourselves. Within a month, the first 10 launch kits were packaged and sent out. Some went to community centers. One to a Native American reservation. Another to a retired steelworker in Michigan who had written Frank a handwritten letter saying, "I just want to feel useful again." Each kit came with a note signed by Frank, "The future isn't somewhere we're waiting to arrive. It's something we build, one brave start at a time. I believe in you. Begin anyway." The stories started pouring in. Photos of makeshift labs in barns and backyards. Videos of grandparents teaching kids to code. Messages from towns where people had stopped expecting anything new. And now, everything felt new. Frank watched it all unfold with awe. He was no longer the center of the story. He was the seed. And that's what he wanted. One night, as he sat outside the lab under the stars, he pulled Marion's letter from his pocket, read it again, and smiled. He whispered into the night, "I did it. And I'm not finished." The road ahead stretched wide, full of unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, Frank wasn't afraid of where it led. He didn't need a map. He had a mission. The town fair hadn't changed much since Frank was a boy. Same dusty parking lot, same faded booths selling kettle corn and hand-carved whistles, same squeaky Ferris wheel that swayed just enough to make your stomach flutter. But this year, something was different. There, in the center of it all, between the old tractor display and the pie contest, sat the Mobile Innovation Lab, gleaming, solar-powered, open to anyone who wandered close enough to wonder what it was. Kids were crowded around a 3D printer watching a small plastic model of the moon emerge layer by layer. A retired mechanic was teaching 2 teenagers how to solder wires to a circuit board. A mother in her 40s sat beside her father, easily in his 70s, helping him set up his first digital blog post. The banner above the lab read, "What will you build next?" Frank stood a few steps away, watching it all, hands in his pockets, wearing his old denim jacket with the sleeves rolled and grease on the cuffs. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He was watching the spotlight move without him now, and that was the greatest gift of all. "It's like a spark caught fire," Tyler said, joining him with a fresh lemonade in each hand. One lab turned into 10. Then 50. Then people started building their own without waiting for permission. Frank took the lemonade, nodded. Because they finally realized they could. Launch kits gone international, you know. There's one in Nairobi. Another in a village in northern Norway. Same design. Same quote from you in every box. Frank smiled. Still strange hearing that. My name on something like that. You earned it. You lit the match. The rest of us just followed the glow. Nearby, Emily was interviewing an elderly woman with silver braids who had just completed her first robotics course. The woman said she used to be afraid of technology, afraid it would make her feel obsolete. But then she'd heard about the Mullins method, downloaded the free starter guide, and started teaching herself, one line of code at a time. Now she was mentoring kids in her neighborhood. "I don't want to disappear quietly," she said. "I want to leave a trail." Frank wiped at his eyes. Just a bit of dust, he told himself. Maybe a little pride. Maybe both. That evening, after the fair died down and the booths started packing up, Frank took a walk down to the riverbank. The same path he'd walked when this journey began. The bench was still there, the one where he'd sat alone with a broken heart and a body that felt like it was rusting in place. He sat again, letting the quiet settle in. The sky was painted in deep indigos and streaks of orange. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a fresh letter he'd written in reply to Harriet, the 83-year-old woman who had sent him that first thank you months ago. In it, he'd written, "You reminded me that it's never one person doing the work. It's always a chain. Someone says something that lights a thought in someone else, and suddenly the world begins again. Keep creating. Keep risking. You are the proof that legacy isn't what we leave. It's what we allow to live." He read it once more, then tucked it away. Somewhere behind him, he heard footsteps. Emily. Tyler. Mia. Diego. A few others from the lab. They didn't say anything. Just sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way people do when words aren't needed. And then, one by one, they started pulling out slips of paper. Letters from people who had written in, stories of transformation, courage, late life beginnings. They read them aloud under the stars. A 91-year-old man in Montana who built a drone with his grandson. A widowed woman in Alabama who learned to weld and started a sculpture garden in her backyard. A group of veterans in Arizona who converted an old bus into a solar-powered mobile classroom. Frank listened, the lump in his throat growing with each story. Not because he was proud of himself, but because he was proud of all of them, of what they'd decided to believe. When it grew quiet again, Emily turned to him. "You always said you were just an old man with a toolbox. But you became something else." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What's that?" "A reminder." Frank let that settle in. A reminder. Not a hero. Not a genius. Just a symbol that life doesn't close the door when you turn 60. It opens a new one. If you're brave enough to knock. He stood up, stretched, looked out over the water one last time. "I think it's time," he said. "For what?" Tyler asked. "The next build. You've got an idea?" "I always have an idea." They walked back together toward the lab, toward the town, toward whatever waited next. And as they walked, Frank thought about Elon Musk, not the billionaire or the celebrity, but the man who once dared to bet everything on ideas too big to be safe. The man who said, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank had taken those words and carved a whole new world out of them. Not with rockets or algorithms, but with second chances. With belief. With the stubborn refusal to accept that time had passed him by. Back at the lab, Frank opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh blueprint. Blank. He rolled it onto the work table, smoothed the corners, and picked up his pencil. Then he looked around the room. Who's ready to build something ridiculous? Laughter. Cheers. And then silence, as they leaned in and got to work. Somewhere far above, a satellite passed overhead, one built by a company founded by a man who'd once faced ridicule, resistance, and the impossible. Now it circled the earth like a witness to everything unfolding below. Frank didn't know what he'd build next. He didn't need to. The legacy had already begun. Not in steel or circuits or solar panels. But in the people who had stopped waiting for permission. Who had begun again. Who had found their place in the constellation of progress. And in that moment, pencil in hand, surrounded by voices, laughter, courage, and light, Frank Mullins realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: he had not aged out. He had grown in. The final spark had caught. And America was glowing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?